Carl Jung did not begin with the question of what man thinks. He began with a far more dangerous question. What lives beneath thought itself? That is where his force still strikes. He strips away the flattering illusion that a human being is a rational creature who simply makes choices in the light. He reveals something harder. We are also shaped by what we do not see, what we do not admit, and what we do not control. Long before modern psychology became obsessed with behavior, productivity, and diagnosis, Jung confronted the hidden architecture of the soul. He saw that consciousness is only the surface. Beneath it moves a deeper life made of dreams, symbols, forgotten wounds, ancient images, and silent tensions. This was not mystical decoration. It was a direct challenge to the human ego. Are you truly the one directing your life? Or are you being moved by forces you have never had the courage to face? That is why Jung matters. He does not comfort man. He demands that man descend. He demands that we look at the parts of ourselves we exile in order to appear stable, moral, or successful. In his vision, the human being is not a finished identity, but a divided interior world struggling toward wholeness. Reason alone cannot save us. Social roles cannot define us. What we call the self is often only a mask stretched over conflict, and now the question becomes unavoidable. If so much of our life is shaped by the unseen, then every dream, every symbol, every inner fracture is no longer accidental. It becomes a message. It becomes a door. To understand Jung, then, is to enter that door and follow the hidden structure of the psyche step by step, from the first descent into the unconscious to the final struggle of becoming whole. Chapter 1. The door into the unconscious. This is the threshold where Carl Jung forces us to confront a truth most people spend their lives avoiding. A human being is not limited to what he can explain, defend, or consciously control. Beneath every thought that calls itself rational, beneath every decision that pretends to be free, beneath every identity that appears stable, something older is moving. Something hidden is watching. Something unspoken is shaping the life we claim to command. Jung saw this before modern culture learned how to disguise inner emptiness with performance, productivity, and noise. When the world still placed its faith in reason as the sovereign ruler of the mind, he had already recognized that reason was not king. It was only a fragile minister standing on the surface of a far deeper kingdom. He did not ask only what a person thinks. He asked what lives underneath thought itself. He did not stop at behavior. He demanded that we look at the buried forces that generate behavior long before the conscious mind invents an explanation. This is where the descent begins, not into fantasy, but into structure. Not into superstition, but into the concealed architecture of the soul. Jung reveals that human beings live far more than they know. Consciousness is only a narrow beam. It illuminates a small section of existence and mistakes that small section for the whole. But the mind is not exhausted by what appears in awareness. A person may speak with confidence, plan with discipline, and present a coherent identity to the world, while the deeper layers of the psyche move in another direction entirely. This is why people sabotage what they say they want. This is why desire turns against itself. This is why suffering repeats even when the lesson appears obvious. The conscious self speaks one language, the unconscious answers in another. The first layer Jung exposes is the personal unconscious. This is not an abstract concept. It is the storehouse of everything the conscious self has rejected, forgotten, repressed, or failed to understand. It contains old wounds, unfinished emotions, denied impulses, humiliations that were never metabolized, and memories that no longer appear in daylight but still command the body from the shadows. Nothing truly disappears. The psyche does not erase, it buries, and what is buried does not become powerless, it becomes hidden power. This is the brutal misunderstanding of modern man. He thinks that what he no longer remembers no longer affects him. He assumes that distance is the same as freedom. It is not. The unlived, the ungrieved, the unspoken, the unadmitted continue their work beneath the threshold of awareness. They distort perception. They bend reaction. They infiltrate intimacy. A person may believe he is responding to the present, while in truth he is obeying a wound from years ago. He may think he is choosing freely, while he is only reenacting an unresolved conflict in a different costume. The unconscious does not ask permission, it acts. But Jung does not stop there. He strips away an even deeper illusion, the illusion that the hidden life of the mind is purely personal. Beneath the personal unconscious lies what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper psychic ground not built by individual biography alone. Here the human being is no longer just a private self with private memories. He is also the bearer of ancient patterns, primordial images, and inherited forms of experience that precede his individual life. Before he becomes a social identity, before he becomes a profession, before he becomes a personal story, he is already shaped by universal psychic structures. He carries humanity inside him. This is why the most intimate parts of inner life are often not merely individual. A dream, a fear, a recurring image, a mysterious attraction, a symbol that grips the soul can belong to something older than personal history. Jung understood that across cultures, ages, and civilizations, human beings produce similar figures, similar motifs, similar psychic dramas. The hero, the mother, the shadow, the wise old figure, the descent, the rebirth. These do not survive because they are decorative myths. They survive because they reveal permanent truths about psychic existence. The human soul does not invent itself from nothing. It awakens inside a structure older than the ego. That is why dreams mattered so much to Jung. He did not treat them as random debris from the day. He did not reduce them to noise. He saw them as messages, not from an external supernatural source, but from the psyche itself. The unconscious is not silent. It is constantly trying to speak. The tragedy is that most people no longer know how to listen. They dismiss the language because it is not literal. But the unconscious does not speak in arguments. It speaks in images. It speaks in symbols. It speaks through distortion, displacement, exaggeration, and strange combinations because it is trying to reveal what consciousness refuses to face directly. A dream is not merely a story we watch in sleep. It is a confrontation. It breaks the censorship of the waking ego and reveals tensions that daylight language cannot hold. It may expose fear beneath ambition. It may reveal grief beneath discipline. It may show that the identity a person protects with pride is already cracking from within. Dreams are often sharper than thought because they are not designed to flatter the self. They compensate for one-sided living. When a person becomes too identified with control, the dream may bring chaos. When he worships strength, the dream may bring helplessness. When he hides from longing, the dream may bring desire in monstrous form. The unconscious corrects the lie of conscious balance. And then comes the question most people do not want to face. If symbols are the language of the soul, what happens when a person loses the capacity to read them? He becomes superficially informed and inwardly illiterate. He may know facts, systems, strategies, and techniques, yet remain blind to the inner signals that reveal who he is becoming. Jung saw that symbols are not decorations added to life. They are carriers of psychic truth. They bind emotion, memory, instinct, and meaning into a single image the conscious mind cannot easily dismiss. A symbol does not explain. It reveals. It does not entertain. It demands interpretation. It forces the individual to confront what the surface self would rather leave undefined. Modern people often believe they have outgrown symbols. In reality, they have only lost awareness of the symbols governing them. The psyche does not stop producing them because a civilization becomes technological. It only drives them into different forms. Today, people still surrender themselves to images, myths, projections, and collective fantasies, but they do so without understanding what they are serving. Modernity has not solved the problem of the unconscious. It has only become more efficient at distracting us from it. The screen replaces silence. The schedule replaces reflection. The public mask becomes stronger while the inner structure becomes weaker. But beneath this speed, the same ancient forces remain. Fear still governs, desire still divides, meaning still haunts, the unconscious still waits for recognition. This is why Jung remains dangerous. He does not comfort the ego. He dismantles its sovereignty. He reveals that much of what we call identity is incomplete. Much of what we call knowledge is defensive. Much of what we call self-control is only ignorance of deeper forces. He demands that we confront the humiliating possibility that we are not fully transparent to ourselves. And yet this humiliation is the beginning of depth, because only the person who accepts that he is divided can begin the work of integration. Only the person who sees that he is inhabited by unknown forces can stop being unconsciously ruled by them. At the center of this psychological revolution is a severe existential demand. Know yourself does not mean describe your preferences. It means descend beneath the performance of selfhood and face what has been disowned. What do you fear that you never name? What grief continues to shape your choices in silence? What image keeps returning because your life has refused its truth? What part of your inner life have you exiled in order to remain acceptable, functional, admired, or safe? These are not decorative questions. They are the dividing line between a life lived from the center and a life lived from evasion. Jung understood that the greatest danger is not darkness itself. The greatest danger is unconscious darkness. What remains unseen gains control. What remains unnamed seeks expression through symptom, compulsion, anxiety, projection, and repetition. A person does not become whole by being good at appearances. He becomes whole by recognizing the hidden life within him and refusing to let it remain a stranger. This is not an invitation to narcissistic self-obsession. It is a demand for inner honesty. The unconscious is not there to be worshipped. It is there to be encountered, interpreted, and integrated. A symbolic figure helps make this clear. The dreamer standing before a locked door does not represent weakness. He represents the human condition itself. The door is the threshold of the unknown within. The lock is fear. The hesitation is the ego defending its small territory. But the deeper truth is merciless. Life does not become meaningful by remaining outside that door. Meaning begins when the individual dares to enter the regions where certainty collapses and deeper knowledge starts. Through that figure, we see the real drama of existence. Man is not only a creature who acts in the world, he is also a being called inward, summoned to decipher the concealed text of his own soul. Everything converges here. The personal unconscious reveals that forgotten life still acts. The collective unconscious reveals that the individual soul is rooted in humanity itself. Dreams reveal that the hidden mind is always speaking. Symbols reveal that truth often arrives in forms reason alone cannot contain. Jung ties these threads into a single devastating insight. A human being is larger, darker, older, and more divided than he wants to admit. But precisely because of that, he is also more profound than he imagines. The way inward is not escape from life. It is the condition for meeting life truthfully. And at the moment we stop fleeing the hidden depths within us, the first real door to the self finally opens. Chapter 2. The Ancient Patterns Within Every Human Being. You are not as original as you believe, and that is precisely where your depth begins. What you call your personality, your desires, your fears, your sense of meaning, is not built from nothing. It is shaped by forces that existed long before you were born. It is structured by patterns you did not choose, yet continuously live out. And until you confront this, you will keep mistaking inherited structure for personal freedom. Carl Jung saw this before modern culture became obsessed with individuality as a performance. Before the language of self-creation dominated identity, he had already uncovered something far more unsettling. The human being does not begin as a blank slate. He enters the world already carrying forms of experience that are ancient, universal, and deeply embedded. These are not memories in the personal sense. They are patterns of perception, emotion, and behavior that organize how reality is lived from within. Jung called them archetypes, not as abstract theory, but as living structures shaping the human psyche from the inside. The first truth is unavoidable. There are patterns within you that you did not invent, yet they govern how you experience life. The archetype is not an idea you learn. It is a form you inhabit. It shapes how you love, how you fear, how you imagine power, how you respond to loss, how you seek meaning. It is not visible in itself. It reveals itself through images, impulses, dreams, and recurring emotional structures. When a person feels drawn to protect, to nurture, to sacrifice, something deeper than social conditioning is at work. When a person feels compelled to fight, to conquer, to overcome impossible odds, he is not only reacting to circumstances, he is embodying a pattern older than his biography. The misunderstanding of the modern mind is to reduce everything to personal history. It assumes that if you trace an emotion far enough, you will find a childhood cause and therefore an explanation. Jung breaks this illusion. He shows that even if personal experience shapes expression, it does not create the underlying form. The structure comes first. The experience fills it. This is why different individuals, in different cultures, separated by centuries, can produce the same inner images, the same symbolic narratives, the same emotional dramas. The psyche is not isolated, it is patterned. Consider the figure of the Great Mother. This is not simply your biological mother. This is a universal image that carries both nourishment and destruction, both protection and engulfment. It appears in myths, in dreams, in emotional life. It shapes how a person experiences care, dependence, and vulnerability. A man may believe he is choosing partners freely, yet repeatedly finds himself drawn to the same emotional dynamic, the same structure of need and control, the same oscillation between safety and suffocation. He calls it coincidence. It is not. It is the archetype expressing itself through his life. Or consider the hero. Not the superficial version celebrated by modern storytelling, but the deeper psychological pattern. The hero is the part of the psyche that confronts chaos, descends into danger, and attempts to transform it. It is the impulse to face what is unknown, to endure suffering, to emerge changed. This pattern does not belong to a specific culture. It belongs to the structure of human becoming. Every individual at some point is called into this pattern, whether he accepts it or not. The crisis that forces a person to grow is not random. It is the activation of a deeper form demanding transformation. This is where the second truth cuts deeper. The most personal experiences you have may not be personal at all. They may be expressions of something universally human. What you feel as uniquely yours may be the repetition of an ancient pattern moving through you. Your loneliness, your longing, your fear of abandonment, your hunger for recognition, your resistance to change, these are not isolated defects. They are part of shared human structures, and yet this does not reduce their intensity. It intensifies their significance because it means your inner life is not trivial. It is connected to the entire history of human existence. But here lies the danger. If you remain unconscious of these archetypal forces, you do not escape them. You become possessed by them. The archetype does not disappear when ignored. It becomes exaggerated, distorted, uncontrolled. A person dominated by the hero may become obsessed with conquest, unable to rest, unable to accept limitation, turning life into endless battle. A person overwhelmed by the mother may lose all autonomy, dissolving into dependence, unable to separate identity from attachment. What was meant to guide becomes what consumes. What was meant to structure becomes what imprisons. Modern life does not eliminate these patterns. It disguises them. In the age of technology, speed, and constant stimulation, the archetypes still operate, but they appear in fragmented, unconscious forms. People chase recognition without understanding the archetype of the hero behind ambition. They seek comfort without recognizing the pull of the mother behind dependency. They fear failure without realizing they are confronting a symbolic death required for transformation. Modernity has not freed us from these forces. It has only removed the language that allows us to understand them. Even in 2025, where information is infinite and identity can be endlessly reconstructed, the same ancient structures persist beneath the surface. The difference is that now they act without interpretation. A person may believe he is choosing his path, while in reality he is reenacting a pattern he has never named. He may believe he is being authentic, while he is only expressing an unconscious script. The illusion of freedom becomes stronger precisely because the underlying forces are more hidden. This leads to a more uncomfortable confrontation. If you are shaped by archetypes, then who are you? Where does individuality begin? Where does freedom exist? Jung does not deny individuality. He redefines it. You do not become yourself by escaping these patterns. You become yourself by becoming conscious of them, by recognizing the forces within you, by seeing how they shape your perception, by refusing to let them operate blindly. You begin to differentiate yourself from them. Freedom is not the absence of structure. It is awareness within structure. This is where the psychological depth becomes existential. The fear is not that you are influenced by something ancient. The fear is that you might never become aware of it, because then your life is not truly lived. It is enacted. It is repeated. It is driven by forces you mistake for your own will. And the tragedy is silent. There is no visible collapse. There is only the quiet persistence of patterns that never transform. The inner tension this creates is not accidental. It is necessary. Because the archetypes are not only forces of repetition, they are also forces of development. The hero does not exist only to fight. It exists to transform the individual. The mother does not exist only to protect. It exists to ground the psyche in care and connection. Every archetype contains both danger and possibility. Integration is the difference. Consciousness is the difference. Without it, the pattern controls you. With it, the pattern becomes a resource. A symbolic figure makes this undeniable. The individual standing between two paths, one familiar and one unknown, is not simply making a decision. He is standing at the intersection of archetypal forces. One path represents safety, repetition, the pull of the known. The other represents risk, transformation, the call of the hero. The hesitation is not weakness. It is the psyche recognizing the weight of what is at stake. Because to choose the unknown is not only to change circumstances. It is to activate a deeper pattern that will demand everything. Everything converges into a single realization. You are not separate from humanity. You are an expression of it. The patterns within you are not accidents. They are structures that have shaped human existence across time. But you are not condemned to be their passive carrier. You are capable of becoming conscious of them, of working with them, of transforming their expression through awareness. This is the beginning of real individuality, not the illusion of being different, but the capacity to see what is shared and still choose how to live it. And the moment you recognize that what lives within you is older than your own life, you can no longer pretend that your inner world is simple or safe or fully under your control. Chapter 3. The flow of psychic energy and inner imbalance. Your mind is not stable, and it was never meant to be. What you call your personality is not a fixed structure, but a moving current, a shifting distribution of energy that never stops flowing, redirecting, compensating, and collapsing. And if you do not understand how this energy moves, you will spend your life wondering why you keep becoming someone you never intended to be. Carl Jung saw this before psychology reduced the human being to static traits and measurable behaviors. When the world still believed that the mind could be mapped like a machine, he had already uncovered something far more volatile. The psyche is not a structure you control. It is a system of energy in constant motion. Every thought, every emotion, every impulse carries force. And this force does not disappear. It moves, it transforms, it seeks balance. And when balance is denied, it returns with greater intensity. This is the first rupture in illusion. Nothing in your inner life is isolated. There is no thought without energy, no emotion without consequence, no repression without cost. What you push down does not vanish. It accumulates. What you ignore does not weaken. It gathers pressure. The psyche does not tolerate emptiness. It redistributes. It compensates. It forces equilibrium in ways the conscious mind does not anticipate. Jung called this movement psychic energy, not as metaphor, but as a principle. The mind behaves like a living system where energy flows between opposites. Where there is tension, there is movement. Where there is one-sidedness, there is compensation. If a person lives too rigidly in logic, emotion will not disappear. It will return in distorted form. If a person suppresses anger, it does not dissolve into peace. It transforms into resentment, passive aggression, or sudden eruption. If a person avoids vulnerability, it does not create strength. It creates fragility hidden beneath control. This is where the second truth becomes unavoidable. Imbalance is not an accident. It is the direct result of living too narrowly. The more one-sided your life becomes, the more violently the psyche will attempt to correct it. But the correction does not arrive politely. It arrives as disruption, as anxiety, as conflict, as breakdown. The psyche does not negotiate with your preferences. It demands wholeness. The modern misunderstanding is to treat these disruptions as problems to eliminate. Anxiety must be silenced, conflict must be avoided, discomfort must be numbed. But Jung reveals the deeper reality. These disturbances are not errors, they are signals. They are the psyche attempting to restore balance where consciousness has become rigid. What you call suffering is often the psyche refusing to let you remain incomplete. Consider the mechanism of compensation. When the conscious mind identifies too strongly with one aspect of itself, the unconscious generates its opposite. This is not philosophical symmetry, it is psychological necessity. A person who defines himself as rational will unconsciously generate irrational impulses. A person who prides himself on control will be haunted by chaos. A person who clings to optimism will secretly carry despair. The more extreme the conscious position, the more intense the unconscious counterforce. This is why people are often shocked by their own reactions. They say, "This is not me," as if the eruption came from outside. But it did not. It came from the part of them they refused to recognize. The psyche does not create opposites to destroy you. It creates them to complete you. But if you refuse to integrate them, they appear as enemies instead of as missing parts. Then there are complexes, the most precise manifestation of this hidden energy. A complex is not just a memory. It is a charged cluster of emotions, images, and experiences that operate like a semi-autonomous entity within the psyche. It has its own energy, its own triggers, its own logic, and when activated, it can take control of perception and behavior without the conscious mind fully understanding what is happening. This is where the illusion of control collapses. You believe you are responding to the present, but in reality, a complex has been activated. A tone of voice, a gesture, a situation touches something unresolved, and suddenly your reaction is disproportionate, stronger than the moment requires, sharper than you intended. You justify it, you rationalize it, but the truth is more disturbing. You were not fully in control. Something within you took over. Jung saw that complexes are not pathological exceptions. They are universal. Everyone carries them. They are formed from emotionally intense experiences that were never fully processed, and because they are not integrated, they remain active. They wait. They watch. And when the right trigger appears, they seize the moment. This is why people repeat patterns they claim to hate. This is why they return to the same conflicts, the same relationships, the same forms of suffering. The complex is not interested in your conscious intentions. It is interested in expressing its stored energy. The deeper tragedy is not that complexes exist. The tragedy is that they remain unconscious, because what is unconscious cannot be negotiated with. It acts without dialogue. It shapes behavior without reflection. And the person lives inside a pattern he does not see, calling it fate, calling it personality, calling it reality, while never recognizing the internal force that sustains it. Even in 2025, where psychological language is everywhere, true understanding remains rare. People speak about triggers, trauma, patterns, yet continue to live one-sided lives. They chase productivity while ignoring exhaustion. They pursue success while suppressing meaninglessness. They maintain control while denying emotional chaos. And when imbalance erupts, they treat it as interruption instead of revelation. Modern life has not reduced inner conflict. It has accelerated it because it provides endless ways to avoid listening. But the psyche does not forget. It does not forgive avoidance. It intensifies. The longer something is denied, the stronger its return. This is why breakdowns often feel sudden but are never accidental. They are the result of accumulated imbalance reaching a threshold. The system can no longer compensate quietly. It forces confrontation. This leads to a more severe question. What would happen if you stopped resisting this movement? What if instead of silencing discomfort, you followed it? What if instead of dismissing irrational reactions, you investigated them? What if instead of suppressing inner tension, you treated it as information? This is where psychological work begins. Not in controlling the psyche, but in understanding its movement. Because psychic energy is not your enemy. It is the raw material of transformation. The same force that creates anxiety can create insight. The same tension that produces conflict can produce growth. The same imbalance that disrupts your life can redirect it toward something more complete. But only if you stop treating symptoms as enemies and start reading them as messages. A symbolic figure reveals this with brutal clarity. The person trying to hold water in a closed fist is not lacking strength. He is misunderstanding the nature of what he holds. The tighter he grips, the more he loses. Psychic energy cannot be contained through force. It must be allowed to flow, to move, to redistribute. Control without understanding leads to loss. Awareness without rigidity allows transformation. Everything converges into a single principle. The psyche seeks balance, whether you cooperate or not. It will move energy from where there is excess to where there is absence. It will generate opposites where there is one-sidedness. It will activate complexes where there is unresolved tension. And it will disrupt your life if necessary to restore equilibrium. You are not suffering because something is wrong with you. You are suffering because something within you is trying to correct you. But correction without awareness feels like chaos, and chaos without interpretation becomes fear. The task is not to eliminate this movement. The task is to understand it, to follow it, to integrate it. And the moment you realize that what disturbs your inner life is not random but purposeful, you can no longer pretend that your suffering is meaningless. You are not who you present to the world, and the more perfectly you perform that role, the further you drift from yourself. What you call identity in public is often a construction, a negotiation, a mask shaped by expectation, fear, and the demand to belong. And the tragedy is not that this mask exists. The tragedy is when you forget that it is a mask. Carl Jung saw this before society turned performance into a permanent condition, before identity became something curated, optimized, and constantly displayed. He had already uncovered the mechanism behind it. The human being cannot enter society without adaptation. He must present a version of himself that can function, communicate, and be accepted. This constructed layer is what Jung called the persona. It is not false in itself. It is necessary. But necessity becomes danger the moment it replaces truth. The persona is not your essence. It is your interface. It is the face you build to meet the world. It organizes behavior. It filters expression. It allows you to navigate roles, responsibilities, and relationships. Without it, social life would collapse into chaos. But the persona carries a hidden cost. The more you invest in it, the more you risk identifying with it. And once that identification becomes complete, you lose access to the deeper layers of your being. This is where the first fracture appears. You begin by using the mask. Eventually, the mask begins to use you. You shape it to gain approval, to avoid rejection, to maintain stability. But over time, you no longer know where it ends and where you begin. You speak through it, you think through it, you measure yourself through it, and what remains outside of it becomes unfamiliar, uncomfortable, even threatening. The modern mind calls this success, being admired, being effective, being recognized. But Jung reveals the hidden contradiction. The more perfect the persona becomes, the more fragile the inner life grows, because everything that does not fit the mask must be pushed away. Complexity is reduced, contradictions are denied, weakness is hidden, desire is filtered. The self becomes narrower, more rigid, more dependent on maintaining the image it has created. This leads to a silent division. There is the person you show and the person you are becoming underneath. And the distance between these two is not static. It grows. Every time you suppress a thought because it does not fit your role, the gap widens. Every time you hide an emotion because it threatens your image, the gap deepens. Every time you choose appearance over authenticity, the structure strengthens, but the center weakens. The danger is not immediate collapse. The danger is gradual disconnection. You continue to function, you continue to succeed, you continue to be seen. But something inside begins to lose coherence. You feel it in moments of silence, in sudden fatigue that cannot be explained, in a sense of emptiness that no external achievement fills. This is not a lack of success. It is the cost of living too long behind a mask. Jung understood that the persona is built through interaction with society. It is shaped by what is rewarded, what is punished, what is expected. A child learns quickly which expressions are accepted and which are rejected. He adjusts. He refines. He constructs a version of himself that can survive. This process is not conscious. It is adaptive. But what begins as adaptation becomes identity if never questioned. And here lies the deeper conflict. The persona is not designed to hold the entirety of a human being. It is selective by nature. It highlights certain traits and excludes others. It amplifies what is useful and hides what is inconvenient. But the excluded does not disappear. It moves into the unconscious. It becomes part of what Jung later calls the shadow. And the more rigid the persona, the more intense the shadow becomes. This is why people who appear the most controlled often experience the most violent inner disruptions. The mask holds too tightly. The excluded parts accumulate pressure, and eventually something breaks, not because the person is weak, but because the structure is incomplete. No human being can live indefinitely in a reduced version of himself without consequence. In 2025, this dynamic has not weakened. It has intensified. The persona is no longer limited to physical interaction. It is extended into digital space, into constant visibility, into endless comparison. The mask is no longer something you wear occasionally. It becomes something you maintain continuously. You are not only expected to function, you are expected to perform, to present a consistent, controlled, optimized version of yourself at all times. But the psyche does not evolve at the same speed as technology. It still demands authenticity. It still requires integration. And the more energy you invest in maintaining the persona, the less energy remains for confronting what lies beneath it. The result is not stability, it is exhaustion. A life that looks complete from the outside but feels fragmented from within. This brings us to the second rupture. Crisis is often the moment when the persona begins to crack, not as failure, but as necessity. When the mask can no longer hold the complexity of the inner life, it starts to break. This may appear as confusion, as loss of direction, as emotional instability, as sudden questioning of everything that once felt certain. But this is not destruction. It is exposure. The person who has lived too long through a role suddenly faces a question he cannot answer. Who am I without this? Without the title, without the recognition, without the structure that defined me. And this question is not philosophical. It is existential. Because without the persona, the individual is forced to confront the parts of himself he has avoided for years. This is where most people retreat. They rebuild the mask. They reinforce it. They search for a new role to replace the old one. Anything to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. But Jung points in another direction. He suggests that this breakdown is not something to escape, but something to pass through. Because only when the persona loses its absolute authority can the deeper self begin to emerge. The psychological tension here is severe. To loosen the mask feels like losing control. It feels like risking rejection, instability, uncertainty. And it is. There is no safe way to dismantle a structure you have relied on for survival, but there is also no way to become whole while remaining confined within it. A symbolic figure clarifies this without illusion. The actor who forgets he is acting does not become more authentic. He becomes trapped. He continues the performance even when the stage is empty. He speaks lines that no longer belong to any real situation. He lives inside a script that has outlived its purpose. And the longer he continues, the harder it becomes to remember that there was ever a self outside the role. Everything converges into a single realization. The persona is necessary, but it is not sufficient. It allows you to exist in the world, but it does not allow you to know yourself. It protects you, but it also limits you, and if you never question it, you will confuse adaptation with identity, performance with truth, survival with meaning. To confront the persona is not to destroy it. It is to see it clearly, to recognize where it serves you and where it confines you, to understand that behind every role you play, there is a larger self that cannot be reduced to any single function. And that self does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It waits. It presses. It seeks expression in ways the mask cannot control. And the moment the mask begins to crack, you are no longer able to hide behind who you pretend to be. What you reject in yourself does not disappear. It waits, it watches, and it returns with greater force. The darkness you refuse to face does not weaken over time. It organizes itself in silence, shaping your reactions, your judgments, your desires, until you are no longer acting freely but being driven by what you deny. And the most dangerous illusion is believing that you are only what you choose to show. Carl Jung saw this before morality turned into performance, and before people learned to hide their contradictions behind polished identities. When the world still believed that goodness was a matter of suppressing what is unacceptable, he had already uncovered a deeper and more unsettling truth. The human being is not divided into clean categories of good and evil. He is a totality that includes both. And what he refuses to include consciously does not vanish. It becomes the shadow. The shadow is not merely the worst part of you. It is everything you have disowned, everything that did not fit your image, your values, your role, your persona. It contains aggression, envy, fear, selfishness, desire, but also vitality, creativity, instinct, and strength that you were never allowed to express. It is not only darkness in the moral sense. It is everything that was pushed out of awareness to maintain a certain identity. This is where the first confrontation begins. You do not see your shadow directly. You encounter it through distortion, through projection, through the sudden intensity of your reactions to others. What you cannot accept in yourself, you will locate in someone else. You will judge it, reject it, fight it, condemn it, without realizing that the source of your reaction is internal. The shadow does not announce itself, it disguises itself as external truth. This is why certain people disturb you more than others. Not because they are objectively worse, but because they reflect something you have not integrated. The arrogance you despise, the weakness you cannot tolerate, the selfishness you condemn, the chaos you fear. These are not random irritations. They are mirrors, and the intensity of your reaction is the measure of your blindness. The modern mind resists this violently. It prefers to believe that judgment is clarity, that rejection is strength, that distance is superiority. But Jung strips this illusion. He reveals that projection is not a sign of moral correctness. It is a sign of unconsciousness. The more certain you are that the problem is outside, the less you have examined what is inside. This leads to the second truth, and it cuts deeper. The shadow does not only contain what is socially unacceptable, it also contains what is personally unlived. Your unused potential, your suppressed ambition, your buried courage, your denied desires, all of this belongs to the shadow. It is not only the place of what you fear, it is the place of what you have not allowed yourself to become. A person who always appears controlled may have a shadow filled with chaos and passion. A person who presents himself as selfless may carry a shadow of intense, selfish desire. A person who prides himself on strength may hide a shadow of vulnerability so deep he cannot even name it. But these are not defects to eliminate. They are realities to integrate. Because what you refuse to own will own you. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. The shadow expresses itself indirectly when it is not acknowledged directly. It appears in sudden outbursts, in irrational decisions, in destructive patterns, in relationships that repeat the same pain under different forms. You believe you are choosing. In reality, you are compensating for what you have denied. Even in 2025, where language about self-awareness is everywhere, the shadow remains largely untouched. People talk about growth, about healing, about becoming better, yet continue to construct identities that exclude everything uncomfortable. They curate themselves. They optimize themselves. They refine their persona while the shadow grows denser beneath it. Modern life has not reduced repression. It has made it more sophisticated. The result is not harmony. It is fragmentation, a life that appears coherent but feels internally divided, a person who knows how to act but does not know how to face himself. And when the shadow breaks through, it does not do so gently. It erupts, it disrupts, it exposes, not as punishment, but as inevitability. This is where the real question emerges. Are you willing to see what you have spent your life avoiding? Not the parts that are easy to admit, but the parts that contradict your image of yourself. The impulses you judge in others, the desires you consider unacceptable, the thoughts you silence before they fully form. This is not a moral exercise. It is a psychological necessity. Jung does not ask you to become your shadow. He demands that you recognize it, because only what is seen can be integrated. Only what is named can be transformed. The goal is not to act out every impulse. It is to remove the blindness that gives those impulses uncontrolled power. Awareness does not eliminate darkness. It changes your relationship to it. This is where maturity begins, not in perfection, but in integration. To know that you are capable of cruelty does not make you cruel. It makes you conscious. To recognize your capacity for envy does not make you weak. It makes you honest. To admit your desire for power does not corrupt you. It reveals the force you must learn to direct. The shadow is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is. A symbolic figure reveals this without illusion. The person standing before his reflection in darkness does not see a monster separate from himself. He sees a distorted version of what he refused to acknowledge. The fear is not of the image itself. The fear is recognition, because once you see it clearly, you can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer pretend that your actions are detached from what lives within you. Everything converges into a single demand. Stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable fragments. Stop pretending that morality is achieved by exclusion. Stop believing that what you reject disappears. The human being is not meant to be pure. He is meant to be whole. And wholeness requires confrontation. The shadow carries both danger and possibility. Left unconscious, it destroys. Brought into awareness, it transforms. It restores energy that was locked in repression. It expands identity beyond fragile ideals. It allows a person to act with greater depth, greater honesty, greater control, not because he is perfect, but because he is no longer blind. And the moment you truly see the parts of yourself you have spent your life denying, you lose the right to remain who you were. Chapter 6. The Hidden Complexes That Quietly Control Your Life. You are not reacting to the present as much as you think. You are reacting to something that has already happened and never truly ended. What you call your personality is not a unified voice. It is a field of competing forces, fragments of past experience that continue to live, act, and interfere with your present without asking for your permission. And until you recognize these hidden structures, you will keep repeating the same pain while believing it is new. Carl Jung saw this before psychology reduced human behavior to simple cause and effect. When the world still believed that awareness automatically meant control, he had already discovered something far more disturbing. The psyche is not a single center of command. It is populated. It contains clusters of emotional energy that operate like small personalities within you. These are not metaphors. They are active systems. Jung called them complexes, and they do not wait for your approval to act. A complex is not just a memory. It is a charged emotional structure formed around an experience that was too intense, too painful, or too overwhelming to be fully processed. It stores not only what happened, but how it felt, how it was interpreted, and how it was left unresolved. And because it was never integrated, it does not become part of your conscious narrative. It becomes autonomous. This is the first rupture. You believe you are one. You are not. You are divided. There are moments when you are calm, rational, controlled, and there are moments when something takes over. Your tone changes, your perception narrows, your reactions intensify. You say things you did not plan to say. You feel things that seem disproportionate to the situation, and afterward you step back and ask a question that reveals everything. Why did I react like that? That question is the entrance, because the answer is never fully in the present moment. It is in the complex that was activated. Something in the situation touched an old structure, and that structure rose to the surface, not partially, but with full force. And in that moment, you were no longer acting freely. You were being driven. Jung did not see this as abnormal. He saw it as universal. Everyone carries complexes. They are formed in childhood, in relationships, in moments of emotional intensity where the psyche could not fully absorb the experience. A child who felt rejected may develop a complex around worth. A person who experienced betrayal may carry a complex around trust. A moment of humiliation may create a complex around exposure and shame. These do not disappear with time. They remain active, waiting for situations that resemble the original wound. This leads to the second truth, and it is more unsettling. Complexes do not only remember the past, they recreate it. They shape how you interpret reality so that it aligns with their internal structure. You do not see what is there. You see what confirms the complex. A neutral expression becomes rejection. A minor disagreement becomes betrayal. A delay becomes abandonment. The complex filters perception before consciousness has time to evaluate. This is why patterns repeat. Not because life is against you, but because something within you is organizing your experience in a specific way. You enter different situations, meet different people, live in different environments, yet encounter the same emotional outcomes, and you call it coincidence or bad luck or fate. But Jung reveals the mechanism. It is not fate, it is structure. The complex is recreating conditions that allow it to remain active. The modern mind resists this. It prefers external explanations. It searches for better circumstances, better people, better strategies. It believes that if the outside changes, the inside will follow. But the complex does not depend on external reality. It uses it. It adapts it. It bends it to fit its own narrative. And until the internal structure is seen, no external change will break the pattern. Even in 2025, where self-awareness is constantly discussed, true confrontation with complexes remains rare. People identify their patterns intellectually, but do not experience them directly. They label their wounds, but do not observe how those wounds take control in real time. They speak about triggers, but still believe they are fully conscious when reacting. The language has evolved, the awareness has not. This is where the deeper psychological tension emerges. Because to recognize a complex is to accept that you are not always in control, that there are parts of you that can override your intentions, that your reactions are not always aligned with your values. And this is not easy to accept. It threatens the image of yourself as coherent, stable, and self-directed. But avoiding this truth does not restore control. It deepens fragmentation. Because what is not recognized continues to operate. It influences decisions, relationships, perceptions, without ever being questioned, and the person lives in a loop, acting, reacting, repeating, without understanding the internal mechanism that drives the cycle. Jung pushes further. He reveals that complexes are not only sources of distortion, they are also carriers of meaning. Each complex points to something unresolved, something that demands attention. It is not just a problem to eliminate, it is a signal to interpret. Because within the complex lies the emotional truth that was never fully processed. This is where transformation becomes possible, not by suppressing the complex, but by making it conscious, by observing when it activates, by noticing the shift in emotion, in perception, in reaction, by asking what this reaction connects to, what memory, what experience, what unresolved tension. This does not dissolve the complex immediately, but it changes your relationship to it, because awareness creates distance, and distance creates choice. The complex may still activate, but it no longer fully possesses you. You begin to see it as something within you, not as the entirety of you. And this shift is decisive, because what was once automatic becomes observable. What was once overwhelming becomes interpretable. A symbolic figure makes this undeniable. Imagine a person pulled by invisible strings, moving in ways he does not fully understand. He believes he is choosing each movement, but the strings guide him. The moment he sees them, the illusion breaks. The strings do not disappear immediately, but their power changes, because now he can resist, adjust, question. Everything converges into a single realization. You are not only shaped by what you remember, you are shaped by what you have not resolved. The past is not behind you. It lives within you, organized into structures that continue to act. And until you bring these structures into awareness, you will continue to live them out unconsciously. This is not a call for endless analysis. It is a demand for honesty, to notice when your reaction exceeds the situation, to question when a pattern repeats, to confront the possibility that what feels immediate is often historical. This is the beginning of real psychological work, because the goal is not to eliminate complexes. That is impossible. The goal is to integrate them, to understand their origin, their function, their influence, to reduce their autonomy by bringing them into consciousness, to transform them from hidden controllers into known elements of your inner life. And the moment you realize that your strongest reactions are often the voice of something unresolved within you, you can no longer pretend that your life is only shaped by what is happening now. Chapter 7. The Process of Becoming Who You Truly Are. You are not yet yourself, and most of what you call your life is only a preparation for becoming. What you believe is identity is often only adaptation, a collection of roles, defenses, and partial truths assembled to survive the world, not to embody your full existence. And the most difficult realization is this: living correctly is not the same as living truthfully. Carl Jung saw this before modern life turned success into the ultimate measure of a human being. When the world still believed that fulfilling roles was enough, he had already uncovered a deeper demand. The human being is not meant to remain fixed in the identity he first constructs. He is meant to evolve, to confront himself, to integrate what he has avoided, and to become whole. Jung called this process individuation, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. This is where the first rupture appears. You can live an entire life functioning perfectly and still never become yourself. You can succeed in your role, meet expectations, maintain stability, and still feel an unspoken tension beneath everything, because something within you knows that adaptation is not completion, that what you have built is only part of what you are capable of being. Individuation begins when this tension can no longer be ignored. It does not begin with clarity. It begins with disruption, with a sense that what once felt certain is no longer sufficient, with a quiet but persistent question that does not disappear. Is this all? And this question is dangerous, because it does not allow you to remain where you are. Jung understood that this process often emerges in moments of crisis, not because crisis is desirable, but because it breaks the illusion of stability. When the structures you relied on begin to fail, when the persona no longer holds, when the patterns that once worked begin to repeat without meaning, you are forced into confrontation, not with the world, but with yourself. This is the second truth. Becoming yourself requires disintegration before integration. What you thought you were must be questioned. What you relied on must be examined. What you avoided must be faced. There is no direct path from who you are to who you could become. There is only a descent into the parts of yourself you have not yet lived. The modern mind resists this completely. It seeks linear growth, continuous improvement, clear direction. It wants progress without disruption. But individuation does not follow this logic. It is not a straight line. It is a confrontation with contradiction. a movement between opposites, a process that includes confusion, regression, uncertainty, and doubt. Not as failure, but as necessary stages of transformation. Because to become whole, you must integrate what you have excluded, the shadow you denied, the emotions you suppressed, the desires you feared, the potentials you ignored. Individuation is not about becoming better according to external standards. It is about becoming complete according to your internal truth. This is where the psychological tension becomes existential. You are no longer asking how to succeed. You are asking how to live in a way that does not divide you internally. And this question has no easy answer, because what you discover may not align with what is expected, what is rewarded, or what feels safe. Even in 2025, where freedom is celebrated, most people remain confined within invisible structures. They choose paths that are acceptable, identities that are validated, lives that are recognized. But individuation demands something else. It demands that you listen to what is true within you, even when it contradicts what is convenient outside you. This is not rebellion for its own sake. It is alignment, the alignment between your inner reality and your outer life. And this alignment cannot be forced. It must be discovered, slowly, painfully, through confrontation and reflection. Jung did not see individuation as isolation. He saw it as integration, the integration of opposites within the psyche, conscious and unconscious, strength and vulnerability, order and chaos, masculine and feminine forces. The goal is not to eliminate contradiction, but to hold it without fragmentation, because the divided person cannot sustain himself. He is constantly pulled in different directions, constantly compensating, constantly adjusting. But the individuated person begins to form a center, not a rigid identity, but a stable awareness that can contain complexity without collapsing. This leads to a deeper realization. The goal is not perfection, it is wholeness. Perfection is static. It excludes what does not fit. Wholeness is dynamic. It includes contradiction. It allows for imperfection, for change, for growth. It does not demand that you become flawless. It demands that you become real. A symbolic figure reveals this process with clarity. The person walking through a dark forest is not lost in the usual sense. He is in transition. The forest represents the unknown within himself. The fear is not only of what he might encounter, but of what he might discover about who he is. But there is no path around the forest, only through it. Every step into that darkness is a step away from illusion and a step toward integration. He cannot rely on old maps. He cannot return to what he was. He must move forward without certainty. And this is the essence of individuation, not knowing exactly who you will become, but refusing to remain who you are. Everything converges into a single demand. Stop living only the parts of yourself that are easy. Stop defining yourself by roles that limit you. Stop avoiding the internal contradictions that disturb you, because those contradictions are not errors, they are directions. To become yourself is not to invent something new. It is to uncover what has been there, waiting, beneath layers of adaptation and fear. It is to bring into awareness what was unconscious, to integrate what was divided, to live in a way that reflects the full complexity of your being. And this process does not end. There is no final version of yourself. There is only continuous becoming, continuous confrontation, continuous integration. The self is not a fixed point. It is a movement toward greater wholeness. And the moment you stop asking who you should be and begin facing who you actually are, the real journey finally begins. You are not the center of your own psyche, and the part of you that believes it is in control is the very thing that limits you. What you call I is not the totality of who you are. It is only a fragment, a surface organizer, a necessary but incomplete structure that mistakes its position for authority. And the longer it holds that illusion, the further you drift from the deeper force that is actually shaping your life. Carl Jung saw this before modern culture elevated self-assertion into a form of worship. Before the language of identity became obsessed with control, definition, and personal narrative, he had already uncovered a deeper hierarchy within the psyche. The ego is not the ultimate center. It is only the center of consciousness. Beneath it, beyond it, and often against it, there exists something larger, something more comprehensive, something that does not ask for recognition, but quietly directs the movement of the whole. Jung called this the self. This is where the first fracture in illusion begins. The ego believes it is the master because it is what you can observe. It organizes perception, makes decisions, constructs identity, and maintains continuity. It says, "This is who I am, this is what I want, this is what I choose." But what it does not see is how limited its field truly is. It operates within a narrow band of awareness, ignoring the vast terrain beneath it. And yet, it claims ownership over the entire psyche. The self does not operate this way. It is not a voice you hear directly. It is not an identity you can easily define. It is a center of totality, a deeper organizing principle that includes both conscious and unconscious elements. It does not seek control. It seeks integration. It does not impose identity. It reveals it over time, and its movement is not always aligned with what the ego wants. This is the second truth, and it is more difficult to accept. Your life is not guided solely by your conscious intentions. There are moments when you are pushed toward something you did not plan, drawn to something you cannot fully explain, disrupted in ways that force you to change direction. The ego calls this chaos. The self calls this correction, because the self is not concerned with comfort. It is concerned with wholeness, and wholeness often requires the ego to lose its certainty. The structures you build, the roles you identify with, the plans you rely on, these are necessary for stability, but they are not final. When they become too rigid, too narrow, too disconnected from the deeper movement of the psyche, the self intervenes. This intervention is rarely gentle. It appears as crisis, as loss, as confusion, as the collapse of what once felt secure. The ego experiences this as threat. It resists. It tries to restore control, to rebuild the old structure, to return to what was familiar. But the deeper movement does not reverse, because what is being dismantled is not your life. It is your limitation. The modern mind resists this completely. It believes that control is the highest form of intelligence, that clarity means certainty, that success means maintaining direction without interruption. But Jung reveals the deeper contradiction. A life fully controlled by the ego becomes increasingly disconnected from the self. It becomes efficient but empty, stable but shallow, directed but not meaningful. Even in 2025, where autonomy is celebrated and self-definition is treated as absolute, this division persists. People build identities with precision, refine their goals, optimize their behavior, yet feel a quiet dissonance beneath everything. A sense that something is missing, something is not aligned, something is not fully alive. This is not failure. It is misalignment between ego and self. The ego seeks clarity. The self introduces complexity. The ego seeks control. The self introduces uncertainty. The ego seeks stability. The self demands transformation. And this tension is not a flaw, it is the core dynamic of psychological development. Because individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not the expansion of the ego. It is the reorientation of the ego around the self. It is the gradual recognition that you are not the sole author of your life, but a participant in a deeper unfolding. And this requires a shift that most people resist. The ego must learn to step back. This does not mean collapse. It does not mean passivity. It means humility. The recognition that what you know about yourself is incomplete, that your intentions are partial, that your identity is still forming, and that there is something within you that sees further than your current awareness allows. This is where the psychological depth becomes existential, because to listen to the self is to enter uncertainty. It does not give you fixed answers. It does not provide immediate clarity. It communicates through symbols, through dreams, through subtle shifts in direction, through tensions that cannot be resolved logically. It asks you to trust a process you cannot fully control. And this is where most people turn away, because the ego prefers certainty over truth. It would rather maintain a clear but limited identity than enter a process that destabilizes everything it knows. But Jung's insight is unforgiving. Without this shift, there is no real development, only repetition within a confined structure. A symbolic figure makes this undeniable. The king who believes he rules the entire kingdom does not realize that he governs only the visible land. Beneath the surface, unseen forces shape the terrain, influence the seasons, determine the fertility of the soil. If he ignores these forces, his rule becomes fragile. But if he learns to listen, to adjust, to recognize that he is part of a larger system, his authority transforms. It becomes aligned rather than imposed. Everything converges into a single realization. The ego is necessary, but it is not supreme. It gives you structure, but not totality. It gives you direction, but not ultimate meaning. The self is the deeper center, the silent organizer, the force that moves you toward wholeness, even when you resist it. To live only from the ego is to live partially. To listen to the self is to enter a process that will challenge, destabilize, and transform you. But it is also the only path toward a life that feels internally coherent, not because it is controlled, but because it is aligned. And the moment you realize that the voice guiding your life is not always the one you consciously choose, you can no longer pretend that you are the only one in control. You are not one person, and the more you try to become one, the more violently you divide yourself. What you call identity is not unity. It is tension. A field of opposing forces that do not cancel each other out but demand to be held together. And the moment you choose one side while denying the other, you do not become clearer. You become fractured. Carl Jung saw this before modern thinking reduced human complexity into simplified categories of right and wrong, strength and weakness, logic and emotion. When the world still believed that maturity meant consistency and purity of character, he had already uncovered a deeper and more disturbing truth. The human psyche is structured by opposites, and these opposites are not errors to eliminate. They are conditions to endure. This is where the first rupture begins. You want to be strong, but you are also vulnerable. You want control, but you are also driven by forces you cannot control. You seek independence, yet you long for connection. You desire stability, yet you are pulled toward change. These are not contradictions to solve. They are realities to face. And the more you deny one side, the more power it gains in the shadows. Jung described this tension through figures like anima and animus, not as abstract concepts, but as psychological realities. Within every man lives a feminine dimension of sensitivity, emotion, intuition, and relational depth. Within every woman lives a masculine dimension of structure, assertion, direction, and clarity. These are not social roles, they are internal forces, and when they are denied, they do not disappear, they distort. This is the second truth, and it cuts deeper. What you reject in your opposite becomes your weakness. A man who denies his emotional depth becomes rigid, disconnected, unable to understand himself or others. His relationships become shallow because he cannot access the very dimension that gives them life. A woman who denies her assertive force becomes dependent, unable to define boundaries, unable to act with clarity when needed. She loses direction because she has rejected the structure within her. But Jung does not stop at gendered opposites. He reveals a broader principle. Every psychological quality exists in relation to its opposite. Consciousness itself is built on differentiation, but wholeness is built on integration. The problem is not that opposites exist. The problem is that the ego chooses one and rejects the other, believing that identity must be consistent to be real. This is where modern life intensifies the division. In 2025, identity is constantly reinforced through repetition. You define yourself through labels, roles, positions, and then you protect those definitions. You amplify what fits and suppress what contradicts. You build a version of yourself that appears stable, but internally becomes increasingly narrow. The result is not clarity, it is imbalance, because what is excluded does not vanish. It accumulates, and eventually it demands expression, not gently, but forcefully. The person who identifies only with strength collapses when faced with vulnerability. The person who defines himself by control loses himself in chaos when control fails. The person who clings to certainty becomes paralyzed when confronted with ambiguity. This is why inner conflict feels so intense. It is not simply confusion, it is opposition. Two forces within you pulling in different directions, each carrying its own truth, each demanding recognition. And the ego, unable to tolerate contradiction, tries to resolve it by choosing one side. But this is where it fails, because choosing one side does not eliminate the other. It suppresses it, and suppression is not resolution, it is postponement. The conflict remains, but it moves underground. It becomes tension, anxiety, restlessness, dissatisfaction. A constant sense that something is not aligned, even if you cannot name it. Jung's insight is severe. Maturity is not the elimination of contradiction. It is the capacity to hold it, to remain intact while experiencing opposing forces, to resist the impulse to simplify yourself into something comfortable and instead face the full complexity of your inner life. This is not balance in the superficial sense. It is not about finding a middle point where everything feels stable. It is about expanding your capacity to contain tension without collapsing, because real psychological growth does not come from certainty. It comes from the ability to remain present in contradiction without escaping into illusion. This leads to a deeper confrontation. Why do you resist your opposite so strongly? Why does vulnerability feel like weakness? Why does uncertainty feel like failure? Why does dependence feel like loss of self? These reactions are not neutral. They are conditioned, built from experience, reinforced by identity, protected by the ego. But beneath them lies fear. The fear that if you allow the opposite, you will lose control, lose definition, lose who you think you are. And in a sense, this fear is correct. Because integration requires transformation, you cannot remain the same and become whole at the same time. A symbolic figure reveals this without illusion. The person standing between two opposing forces, pulled in both directions, is not broken. He is at the center of his own psyche. The tension he feels is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that both sides are alive. The real danger is not the tension. It is the attempt to escape it. Everything converges into a single realization. You are not meant to resolve yourself into a single, consistent identity. You are meant to become a space where contradictions can exist without destruction, where strength and vulnerability coexist, where control and surrender are both possible, where clarity does not eliminate uncertainty, but includes it. This is what integration means. Not merging opposites into something neutral, but allowing them to remain distinct while held within a larger awareness. The ego does not disappear. It expands. It becomes capable of containing more without breaking. And this is where true stability emerges, not from rigidity, but from flexibility, not from certainty, but from depth, not from eliminating contradiction, but from carrying it without fragmentation. Because the person who cannot hold opposites will always be divided by them, but the person who can contain them becomes something else entirely. Not simpler, but stronger. Not clearer, but deeper. Not perfect, but whole. And the moment you stop trying to resolve your contradictions and begin to face them fully, you can no longer pretend that becoming yourself will ever be comfortable. Chapter 10. The meaning of suffering and spiritual transformation. Suffering is not an interruption of life. It is the place where life reveals its deepest structure. What you call pain is not merely something to endure or escape. It is something that demands to be understood. And the moment you reduce suffering to an accident, you strip yourself of the only path that leads beyond it. Carl Jung saw this before modern culture turned discomfort into something to eliminate at all costs. When the world began to believe that progress meant the removal of pain, he had already uncovered a more unsettling truth. The human psyche does not grow despite suffering. It grows through it, not because suffering is good, but because it exposes what comfort hides. This is where the first rupture appears. You do not suffer randomly. Your suffering has structure. It follows patterns. It returns in different forms. It intensifies when ignored, and it forces confrontation when avoided. The psyche does not produce pain without direction. It produces it when something within you is out of alignment, when something has been denied, when something must change but has not yet been faced. The modern mind rejects this completely. It wants explanation without transformation. It wants relief without understanding. It wants to fix the symptom while leaving the structure untouched. But Jung dismantles this illusion. He reveals that suffering is not only something you experience, it is something you must interpret. This is the second truth, and it is difficult to accept. Not all suffering can be explained by logic. There are moments in life that break the framework of cause and effect, events that feel too precise, too symbolic, too connected to inner states to be dismissed as coincidence. Jung called this synchronicity not as mysticism, but as a recognition that meaning is not always linear. A person dreams of collapse before his life begins to fall apart. Another encounters a symbol repeatedly at the exact moment he is forced to confront a hidden truth. These are not proofs of external design. They are indications that the psyche and reality are not as separate as we assume. That meaning can emerge through connection, not just through causation, but meaning is not given automatically. It must be read. And this is where most people fail, because to read suffering is to stop resisting it long enough to understand it, to ask not only how do I escape this, but what is this revealing? And that question changes everything, because suffering often points to what has been avoided, the life not lived, the truth not spoken, the change not made, the part of the self that has been ignored for too long. Pain becomes the pressure that forces awareness, and awareness becomes the condition for transformation. Jung did not separate this process from something older, something symbolic, something that appears across cultures in different forms, the language of alchemy, not as literal transformation of matter, but as psychological transformation of the self. The movement from fragmentation to integration, from chaos to structure, from unconsciousness to awareness. In alchemical symbolism, the process begins with breakdown, with disintegration, with the collapse of what once held form. This is not failure. It is the necessary dissolution of what is incomplete. Without it, nothing new can emerge. Without it, the structure remains rigid, unable to evolve. This mirrors the human experience. The moments when life breaks you are not only destructive, they are also transitional. They strip away illusions, they expose dependencies, they remove what cannot continue. And what remains is not clarity, but raw material. Something that must be reworked, restructured, redefined. This is where transformation becomes possible, not by avoiding the breakdown, but by moving through it consciously, by recognizing that what is falling apart may be what was holding you in place, that what you are losing may be what was limiting you, that what feels like an end may be the beginning of something more aligned. Even in 2025, where distraction is constant and suffering is quickly covered, the deeper pattern remains. People experience pain, but rarely stay with it long enough to understand it. They move from one distraction to another, from one explanation to another, without ever confronting the underlying transformation being demanded. The result is repetition, the same forms of suffering appearing again and again, different situations, same structure, different people, same conflict. Because what was not understood was not transformed, and what was not transformed continues. This leads to a more severe confrontation. What if your suffering is not meaningless? What if it is the most direct communication from your deeper self? What if it is not asking to be removed, but to be decoded? And what if ignoring it is the very reason it persists? This is not a romanticization of pain. It is a recognition of its function. Suffering without awareness destroys. Suffering with awareness transforms. The difference is not in the intensity of the pain, but in the relationship to it. A symbolic figure reveals this without illusion. The individual placed in fire does not survive by escaping immediately. He survives by enduring long enough for the transformation to occur. The fire is not only destructive, it is refining. It burns away what is unnecessary. It exposes what cannot endure. And what remains is not the same as before. Everything converges into a single realization. Life is not designed to protect you from suffering. It is designed to confront you with it in ways that force growth. The question is not whether you will suffer. The question is whether you will remain unconscious within that suffering or become aware through it. Jung's vision is uncompromising. There is no depth without pain, no transformation without breakdown, no meaning without confrontation. The path is not to avoid suffering, but to enter it with awareness, to read it, to allow it to reshape you. And in that process, something shifts. Not immediately, not completely, but decisively. The same pain that once felt meaningless begins to reveal structure. The same chaos begins to show direction. The same suffering begins to carry meaning. And at that point, you are no longer only enduring your life. You are participating in its transformation. And in that moment, suffering stops being only what breaks you and becomes the force that remakes you. The greatest illusion of human life is believing that we can conquer the world while remaining strangers to ourselves. What Carl Jung reveals is far more severe. Success without inner reconciliation is not fulfillment. It is fragmentation hidden behind achievement. Before modern life turned outward success into the ultimate goal, Jung had already seen the deeper crisis. Man does not collapse because he fails the world. He collapses because he avoids himself. Every chapter of this journey points to the same unavoidable truth. The unconscious does not disappear when ignored. Archetypes do not lose power when unnamed. The shadow does not dissolve when denied. Complexes do not weaken with time. The persona does not become truth by repetition. The ego does not become whole by control, and suffering does not become meaningless simply because it is avoided. What emerges is not a theory. It is a confrontation, a demand to see that the human being is not simple, not unified, not finished. You are layered, divided, driven, and incomplete. But this is not your weakness. This is your condition for becoming. The modern world, even in 2025, offers endless ways to escape this confrontation. It offers distraction instead of reflection, performance instead of truth, explanation instead of transformation. But none of these dissolve the inner tension. They only bury it deeper. And what is buried does not die. It waits. Jung forces a more difficult path. Not the path of comfort, but the path of integration, to face what you reject, to recognize what you project, to listen to what speaks in silence, to accept that you are not only light, but also shadow, not only control, but also chaos, not only identity, but also process. This is where psychological insight becomes existential truth. Because the question is no longer how to live better. It is how to live without lying to yourself, how to stop dividing your existence into acceptable and unacceptable parts, how to stop running from the very forces that shape your life. A single image captures everything, the individual standing before himself, with no mask, no excuse, no projection, no illusion left to hide behind. There is no audience. No role, no performance, only the raw fact of his own being. And in that moment, everything becomes clear. Not comfortable, not resolved, but undeniable. Everything converges into one final realization. The task of a human life is not to become impressive. It is to become whole, not to eliminate contradiction, but to carry it consciously. Not to escape suffering, but to understand what it demands. Not to construct an identity, but to uncover a self. And the moment you stop trying to become someone greater and begin facing everything you already are, you step into the only transformation that has ever truly mattered.